Hi, everybody. Hello, welcome. We're so excited to have everybody here. We're just gonna wait 2 minutes while everybody gets in from waiting room and then Polly will take it away and get us started. All right.
Thank you, Isabel. Good evening and welcome to the Charleston Library Society's Zoom speaker series with Taste the State. We have Kevin Mitchell and David Shields here with us this evening. We are in for a treat. I am Polly Buxton, and I'm coming to you from Buxton Books. We are the independent booksellers at 160 King Street. We are on campus at the Charleston Library Society. And thank you for choosing to spend this time with us. If you have been to Buxton Books or any of these events, you've probably heard what I am about to say, but I am going to start before I give the official introduction. I want to remind everyone about the ecosystem of publishing and book buying. And so we are inviting you to please purchase this book. It's a pre-publication purchase. The book does not come out until October 15th. But we have signed book plates that David and Kevin so graciously signed, and we are also going to have Kevin in the store on the 17th. And so we will talk a little bit more about that and put that information in the chat so you can come by and see him then. But I will remind you to buy books, to buy a new book like Taste the State, buy one for yourself, buy them as gifts. They make signed books, make incredible gifts. This book comes to us from University of South Carolina Press. It is such a wonderful press right here in South Carolina. And that is how books get to be published. That is how we get to hear these new works by established voices, and we get to hear new voices. So please buy a book and buy a book as a gift. We thank you. We thank you for making this possible. We thank you for being a member of the Library Society. If you are, these events are not only for you, but they are made possible by you. So if you are not a member of the Charleston Library Society, please reach out and find out how you can do so. There's just incredible programming coming up this year. And if it has anything to do with books, we will be there. If you would like to purchase this book from us, we have quite a few of these signed book plates signed by both David and Kevin. And we're just before we went live, we were talking to them about getting more. So we will stay well supplied with signed books by both David and Kevin so that these can be the book for you to give this holiday season. Thank you for being here, and thank you to Kevin and to David for joining us. Taste the State presents the cultural histories of native ingredients and showcases the evolution of the dishes and the variety of preparations that have emerged. From the influence of 1920s fashion on asparagus growers to an heirloom watermelon lost and found, this book abounds with surprising stories from South Carolina's singularly rich food tradition. Kevin and David present engaging profiles of 82 of the state's most distinctive ingredients and dishes. From Carolina gold rice, Sea Island white flint corn, chicken bog, and frogmore stew. We're all curious how they chose what food to highlight, because we get quite hungry, and I hope some of you at home are probably in a better place than we are, that we're not able to eat right now. And so we're getting very hungry looking at their slideshow and reading about these foods. This is true Carolina cooking in all of its cultural depth, historical vividness, and sumptuous splendor. Thank you all for being here. We are going to welcome Kevin and David right now. Kevin Mitchell is the 2020 South Carolina Chef Ambassador and the first Black instructor at the Culinary Institute of Charleston. He has multiple degrees in the culinary arts from the Culinary Institute of America and a master's degree in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi. His work focuses on the history of African Americans in the culinary arts and the preservation of Southern ingredients. David S. Shields is the chair of the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation and the Carolina Distinguished Professor of the English Language and Literature Department at the University of South Carolina. He is the recipient of the Southern Foodways Alliance Ruth Fertile Keeper of the Flame Award. His previous titles include Southern Provisions, The Creation and the Revival of a Cuisine, and The Culinarians, Lives and Careers from the First Age of American Fine Dining. If you could see, I don't know how many of you can see who else is in the room, but we have some really extraordinary people here with us live. And I know if you're watching this live, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a foodie in your own right. And thank you, Kevin and David. And we just welcome you. We're going to turn this conversation over to you. Please put questions in the chat. Isabel from the Charleston Library Society is going to be sending some of those in. Some of you submitted questions earlier, so we will wrap this up towards the end with some questions and answers. And if you have any other issues or questions, concerns, please, ideas, please put them in the chat box, and welcome. Thank you, Kevin and David.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're glad to participate in this, and particularly in connection with the Charleston Library Society, which has championed the culture of literature in South Carolina since the 18th century. So it's a wonderful thing to participate in this long-lived community. Isabel, you want to hit the first slide? Kevin, I'm sure a lot of people wonder how we managed to hook up and get involved in all of these projects that over the years. So I thought you might tell your side of the story, and
yes,
we can get to the point where we finally decided to write a book.
Yeah, so I think we first met in 2000, was it 2013 at the Rice Symposium. David was there here in Charleston for the Carolina Gold Rice Symposium. I was one of the chefs that was doing a demo centered around rice, and actually I did a demo on chicken bog. And a lot of people know I'm not originally from the South. I grew up in New Jersey. I've lived in Michigan. I've lived in Ohio. I've lived in Atlanta and all these other places. And that was kind of my first introduction to what chicken bog was. When they asked me to do that, I was like, chicken bog, what? Chicken, I get that. But getting the recipe from Anson Mills gave me a further insight into what chicken bog was. So we met at this symposium, and then a year or so later, the American Culinary Federation hosted their Southeast Regional Conference. David was on a panel discussion, I believe, with Chef Sean Brock. We have a mutual friend, fellow author himself, Chef Matthew Rayford, whose book came out in May called Breast and Yam. Basically brought us back together, and he had a conversation with David about this gentleman named Nat Fuller, who at one point in the late 1800s was the most famous Black caterer in the city of Charleston. And I remember David writing a story for the Charleston magazine about Nat Fuller and some of his predecessors, Eliza Seymour Lee and Sally Seymour. And he approaches me with this, at the time, for me, I thought this really crazy idea to recreate a dinner that Nat Fuller hosted here in Charleston shortly after the end of the Civil War, maybe 2 weeks or so after, where we know Blacks and whites broke bread in the same room in the spirit of equality, in the spirit of reconciliation. And he has this idea, hey, I think we should recreate this dinner 150 years later. And initially I was like, yeah, that would be a great idea. I honestly did not take him too seriously. We go through life, we have conversations, and people kind of go their own ways. But I soon learned that David was extremely serious within 2 weeks of that initial conversation, when he inundated my email with any and every fact known to man about Nat Fuller, who he was, where he cooked, you know, and even the fact that he was a butcher, he was a mixologist, he was a caterer, and all these things about Nat Fuller. So in my mind, I knew, well, hey, this guy is serious. I guess we're going to recreate this dinner. And we assembled a group of people from the College of Charleston, Natalie Dupree, Chef Sean Brock, and many others. And we set on the path of creating our recreation of his original feast in April of 2015. And from the beginning of 2014, this planning for a year, David and I have pretty much been tied at the hip in doing projects. So we went from kind of this Nat Fuller feast to a field pea tasting where we revitalized.
Isabel, shift the slide, please.
Revitalized the workings of George Washington Carver, and we cooked an array of peas, about 20 to 25 different styles of peas, and you can see from the picture here. And this is just a small kind of taste of what we did there. And the really great thing for me to be there doing it, we did it at the William C. Gatewood House, and that was the house in which Nat Fuller lived when he was an enslaved person. So for me to actually be cooking in this kitchen where he cooked was a huge deal for me to do that. So we go from this field pea tasting to just doing other things throughout. And then in 2016, I decided to leave Charleston and go to the University of Mississippi to get my degree in Southern Studies.
Isabel?
Through the convincing of John T. Edge, the director or the executive director of the Southern Foodways Alliance, who suggested that I come to that school based on the work that I was doing. And David was very helpful in helping me maneuver my way through graduate school. As a 46 or so year old graduate student, and relearning how to read and write properly, and really understand specifically how to write as a scholar, not specifically to write as a chef. So, you know, there were some growing pains in the first several months. Some of my first papers were not that stellar, just based on the fact that, once again, relearning how to write from a scholarly position as opposed to writing as a chef. And so going back to school, and then in 2018 coming back to Charleston, and going back to the position I held, or I still hold, at the Culinary Institute of Charleston as a chef instructor there. And then around, I believe, like 2019, David approaches me with this idea to write this book. And it was an idea that he was originally approached with, to kind of do a book about kind of like the top 10 or top 15 dishes of South Carolina. And David honestly was not, I don't think that was where he wanted to go with this particular style of book. He wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the food of South Carolina, and suggested that I, of course, co-author this book with him. And we proposed that to the University of South Carolina Press. They signed on, and then from there we started writing this book. And then, of course, writing it from 2019, and then, of course, in the midst of a pandemic, proved to be pretty interesting. I mean, the book, and David will attest, the book was mainly written via email and Dropbox submissions, where the and I know people are probably curious as how we decided what specific things we were going to write about in the book. And initially, we just had a list of well over 100 things that we wanted to write about. Of course, we're contracted to a certain word limit. So, of course, we actually wrote originally we wrote 100 entries, and then it was whittled down to 82, what we have in the book now. And basically, it was just a list. And David basically gave me the opportunity to choose the particular entries that I was most interested in writing. And then he chose the ones he was most interested in writing. And then we tag team the others. And basically, I would write my sample entry. I would send it to him. He would make some corrections. He would encourage me to stretch my mind a little bit academically when I was writing. And I think what I did for him, the same was for him to kind of stretch his mind and remember that we were right. We want people to really have fun with this book. We didn't want this book to be overly academic, but we also didn't want it to be overly, I guess, for lack of a better term, chefy. But we wanted people to understand the history of these ingredients and these dishes. We wanted to encourage them to possibly cook them. That's why we included recipes. And we wanted to also entertain them with some of these anecdotal things that we write about in specific entries. And here you have it, about 2 years or so later, we have Taste the State.
Yeah. One of the things that is so distinctive about South Carolina is that it has quite a number of ingredients that it gave rise to that were absolutely central, not only to the food of South Carolina, but eventually to the South. And one of the things that I had been doing, since shortly after the millennia, I've been working with the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, which I now chair, and the restoration of Carolina Gold and all of the ingredients that were part of the food system, the stuff that was grown on the plantations of the Low Country, the stuff that was imported and used to create the initial cuisine of the coastal South. And here in this particular slide, you see a number of the things that were functionally extinct at the time that we undertook the restorations in about 2006 that are now part of Southern cooking. We have Carolina Gold Rice up in the corner, purple ribbon sugar cane, the Bradford watermelon, the Carolina Runner African meat peanut, Guinea flint corn, Benet, rice peas, Jimmy red corn, Sea Island red peas. That's just a drop in the bucket. We had a list of maybe 47, 48 ingredients that we thought were absolutely essential to traditional cooking that have been lost. And we started looking 2006, and we found virtually every one of them except 2 strawberries and 1 variety of rye, which we're still looking for since it's the original rye whiskey rye of the South. Isabel, would you change the slide now? Kevin and I were both really enthusiastic about taking the project on, because not only did you have the ingredients that made up this quite distinctive set of foodways in South Carolina, you had an extraordinary trove of recipes in manuscript and also in published form. One of the great resources that people don't realize exists out there available for use are the digitized backlogs of all of the local newspapers in South Carolina. So if you want to find out what was cooking in King's Tree or 96 or Seneca or whatever, the databases like genealogybank.com or Chronicling America, the Library of Congress website, or newspaper.com, you can access them. There's been, this great emphasis about low country cooking for a long time, but the Midlands and the upcountry had really rich and robust traditions of food as well. And where do you find that? It's documented in those newspapers, and it's contained in the manuscript collections of various local historical societies. Isabel?
And what I'll say is what's very interesting about mentioning those newspaper articles, the genealogybank.com and so on. It was a very interesting exercise for me to go through. David, prior to the pandemic, drove to Charleston and we met in my office, and he gave me an example of how he uses those newspaper articles from the South, King Street and all these other places that are, well known for the food that we eat today, and how, just putting in an ingredient in the search engine and then just telling the search engine you want to research newspapers between the years of 1800 and 1830, and you want to research only South Carolina newspapers, and of course hit enter, and then every newspaper article from 1800 to 1830 in every South Carolina newspaper at that time that has that ingredient or dish listed in an article pops up. And the first time he showed me, we were doing the BlackBerry entry, and of course thousands of articles kind of pop up, and I say, well, how are we going to write you'll see in the book, the entries are really not much longer than 2 pages. There are a few that are a little bit more that we had to give a little bit more space to. And we talk about things like Purlieu. We had to give a lot of space to discussing that. So he was showing me how he just kind of combs through these articles and he picks the ones that are most interesting to him, plus the ones that have these really interesting recipes. And then we would kind of do a cut or a copy and paste and put it in a file. And then he would name the file Blackberries. And then, 2 or 3 days later, he would go back, read through, and then start writing his entry. And I thought that was an interesting way of doing research. And I, use that style of research a lot in most of the entries that I wrote. I did, of course, use books related to the subject. For instance, we used Chris Smith's book on okra when we wrote our entry about okra. We write about pot liquor, and there's, the entry for pot liquor quotes a page from John T. Edge's pot liquor book that talks about that. So, the interesting way of doing this research, of course, for me was very new to me, but it also made it really fun. It made it really easy for me to kind of put these things in a file, leave it for a day or so, and then go back to it, put my thoughts together, of course, cite all the sources in which, I used to write that entry, and then pop it in an email and send it to David. And then David sends it back with his comments and suggestions of how I can, make the entry longer, add a few more things about the agricultural part of okra. And then, of course, the recipes for me were the most interesting.
Yeah. One of the things that we should talk about is, how we finally came up with a selection of 82 items. And, in order to think about that, we have to understand exactly what's distinctive about Southern cuisine vis-a-vis the cuisine of the United States. And, you can take a look at it and say, well, in the cuisine of the United States, beef is the most important meat. In the South, it's pork. In the United States, wheat is the most important grain. In the South, it's corn. And you go through the ingredients and make a kind of regional distinction. And then within the region, what is different from South Carolina and other places? One of the things that we made a decision about was we didn't want to do a Southern greatest hits thing. So fried chicken, which historically is associated with Virginia, people do eat fried chicken in South Carolina, but for Virginia Taste the State book, that's where that recipe should be. We have our own distinct chicken dishes. That chicken bog that Kevin was mastering back in 2013 is one of those chicken dishes. So what we did was when we formed a kind of master list of certain things that we thought everyone in South Carolina would recognize, we also wanted to add certain things that once were South Carolina's key foods or ingredients that have become lost for various reasons. And one of the things we wanted to suggest is that a food that belongs to a place changes over time. And certain pressures create problems in terms of availability. At one juncture, the rice bird was considered the tastiest bird to eat in South Carolina. And it was seen floating over the rice fields up until the early 20th century. Now it's in danger and you can't taste it. Once there was a root vegetable called the tanya. It's the corm of the elephant ear plant that was considered the signature vegetable of Charleston. If you moved in as a new resident, your neighbors would bring you a bag of tanya roots. It's still eaten in the West Indies, but for some reason in the early 20th century, those plants became purely ornamental. There's many an elephant ear that grows in the South Carolina, but very few people are digging up the roots for breakfast like they did 120, 30 years ago. And they're still as tasty and edible as possible. One of the things that, yeah, go ahead.
And, with David mentioning some of the ingredients that we definitely wanted to focus in on, I also think, we also included some things that people do not necessarily associate with the South, but going back to those ingredients that were king in this area for years, but are never truly associated. When the initial list came across the email, there was a few on there. The first one, because everything is listed in alphabetical order, the first thing was asparagus. And in my mind, as a chef, I don't associate asparagus with South Carolina. But of course, by doing the research and talking with David and realizing that, as he said, asparagus was one of the king produce here in this area for years. And there is still, and it's the palmetto, and there is one place that I know and believe in Monetta, South Carolina, that still grows that specific type of asparagus that is indigenous to this region. And then there were other things on there, like the blackberry, Um, when we first did that first entry together, I was amazed on, how the blackberry was cultivated in this area and also throughout, specifically throughout the South, but how it still has this tie to South Carolina. And I think, one of the interesting things that people will see when they read the book is they will see these ingredients that they are like, well, hey, how come asparagus or, you know, even oranges we write about in the book, and I'm sure people always associate the orange with, with Florida, Sunkiss, or the Sunkiss soda, or oranges specifically coming from Florida, right? And there's just so many other things that I think people will find fascinating by just kind of rifling through the book and just seeing things that they know are true to the South. They know they are true to this region, and then things that will surprise
Yeah. When everyone thinks about South Carolina, the first thing they tend to think about these days in terms of Southern foods, Carolina Gold rice. And of course, we focus on that. But most people think that Carolina Gold rice was the original rice that was brought in the end of the 17th century. It wasn't. It was a rice that was introduced after the American Revolution, when the war had disrupted the seed production for the original Madagascar white rice. We don't know where Carolina Gold rice came from. We know genetically it's a subtropical japonica, which means, thousands of years ago, it probably came from the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. But rice, like other grains, has a long history of circling the globe. So was this grown in West Africa and brought over? We know the first person who grew it, a man named Hezekiah Mahan, Pineville Plantation in Berkeley County. We know that its properties were immediately recognized. It was productive, and it had this extraordinary mouthfeel that made it ideal for use as a matrix upon which to marry flavors. And it was the ingredient that the African-American chefs recognized as the thing that could be the basis or the palette upon which to construct all of these famous one-pot dishes like chicken bog or Hoppin' John. Isabel? Pilau, purlu, pilaf. If there's any dish that can be, or family of dishes that can be said to be the essence of South Carolina, it's this extraordinary family of dishes which use rice, usually intermingled with another ingredient and a stock based on the boiling of that other ingredient. You see a plate there where crab rice or crab pilau is next to collard greens and a fried mullet. You see the recipe there of Hoppin' John, and you see chicken pilau, which was one of the favorite dishes. I know that Kevin has many thoughts on pilau, so maybe he should chime in here and give his testimony.
Yeah. Well, for one, I'm of course a huge fan of pilau, purlu, whichever way you want to pronounce it. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about food is that no matter where it comes from, people always identify it. And a purlu is a pilau, is a pilaf. It just depends on where you're from. And, this recipe here for Hoppin' John is one of those examples of, where you grow up dictates what is actually used in the Hoppin' John. And I'm talking specifically about the type of peas that are used in Hoppin' John. And in my classroom, I teach the students how to make Hoppin' John by using the black-eyed pea. And some purists from this particular area shame me. They don't even want to prepare the dish if it has black-eyed peas in it. And I actually had a student who refused to make it in class because that is not the peas that she learned how to use from her grandmother growing up. They have to be field peas, or it has to be Sea Island Reds. But for me, growing up in the North, my grandmother taught me how to cook black-eyed peas. So when I make my Hop and John, it's going to be black-eyed peas. Now I will use field peas or Sea Island red peas, but once again, the beauty of food is it kind of expands throughout the world. And David talking about these one pot rice dishes. Everywhere you go, you're going to find a one pot rice dish. Here, of course, we're talking purloo, pilau. In New Orleans, we're talking jambalaya. In France, it's rice pilaf. In Spain, it's paella. But once again, as David said, the one central ingredient is rice. Right? So, and it's just a beautiful, for me to make it. It's a beautiful way of honoring my ancestors who prepared this particular dish specifically as being formerly enslaved people who use that ingenuity to come up with these beautiful dishes that only take one pot, right? And then using the embers to roast potatoes or whole sweet potatoes in the embers, or taking a whole cabbage and roasting it in the embers. So, and I think what we wanted to do with this book and with some of the ingredients that we talk about specifically was to pay homage to those ancestors from Africa, and also, of course, pay homage to those
Isabel?
who come from Europe and many other places as well.
Yeah, one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that South Carolina cookery is an amalgam. It has the Native American components of the pumpkins, squashes, corn, and beans like the civi beans that are beloved, the little butter beans. And here we have the panoply of African diaspora ingredients that are the heart of Gullah Geechee cooking. And there's also the Anglo dimension, which inflects baking and meat roasting and the garden vegetables, some of which are very important, like the cabbage. A lot of people don't realize that South Carolina was at one time the largest cabbage producing state in the United States, and it had a distinctive conical shaped cabbage, a descendant of the famous Filderkraut, the sauerkraut cabbage from Germany. Was called the Charleston Wakefield cabbage. Let me tell you, folks, coleslaw made from a Charleston Wakefield cabbage is the finest thing that you can have in the way of coleslaw. It is superb. Now, I'm sure that Kevin can go around this this border here and comment on these ingredients. All of them have an honored place in South Carolina cooking, not just restricted to the Low Country. I mean, it's the Clemson spineless okra, upstate creation, which now rules as the world's most cultivated okra.
Yeah, and on here, one of the ingredients that has become one of my favorite things to use, you see here in the top left, is the bene seed. The true sesame seed that comes to us from Africa, and has many different uses. Of course, here in Charleston, it's probably most famous for the Benny seed wafer, um, served on the market. But this particular ingredient can also be ground into a flour if you're looking for something gluten free. It could be stirred into a pot of collard greens, to give sustenance, right? Where we know that most when we David mentioned how the hog, or hogs play a big deal in this particular type of food, but we also know that not all enslaved people on every plantation had access to hogs, right? So they had to find something that would give them that feeling of having this hearty, earthy, meaty thing, and that's where the Bene seed would come in, and once again ground into a flour and stirred into a pot of greens, also as a thickening agent as well, right? Which of course we use the okra, seeds to do that as well. Of course, when we make gumbo, and and of course the Bene seed would be pressed into oil. Probably the most famous oil in the into the 1800s, a major cooking medium, here in Charleston. So famous, so popular that Thomas Jefferson wanted to grow Bene himself, and we don't think he was very successful. I'm thinking due to the growing season and the environment in Virginia, but his enslaved people write about the use of Bene seed and Bene seed oil in these wafers, in a pot of greens, ground into a flour, to of course offset those who are eating gluten free. And then the okra, the versatility of that particular ingredient, on how we write in the book that okra is kind of the vegetable people love to hate or hate to love. So basically, if you are from the north, you don't necessarily have an affinity for this very mucusy, slimy vegetable. Northerners just don't appreciate that flavor. But here in the South, the people in the South, they appreciate that 100%. And even I, living or growing up in the North, my grandmother grew up in North Carolina, and she always made a pot of stewed okra and tomatoes. So I have this huge affinity for okra. And then, of course, just experimenting with drying it and then grinding it into a flour, which which Clay Oliver from Oliver Farms, you see here with the Bene seed oil, has done some really great work with the okra flour, and also pressing the oil from the seeds as well. And I do believe Anson Mills is experimenting with that as well. So you see these ingredients, and you saw those peas, and then of course some of the other ingredients, how they just play this important role on the food of the South, and specifically the food of Charleston, based on those people coming to this country.
Isabel. Isabel. One of the important ingredients of South Carolina is the Carolina runner African peanut, the ancestral peanut of the South. And this was lost sometime in the 20th century. And we managed to track down about 20 seeds in the freezer of a North Carolina State professor who was a peanut breeder. And those were sent to Brian Ward of Clemson, who re-brought out this seed for this wonderful peanut, whose oil quality is so much more superior to modern day peanuts. It's a sweeter, smaller peanut than the Virginias that you're familiar with. And here is a field of the restored peanut that's being grown in Sumter, South Carolina. Peanut butter made from this was tremendous. But one of the things which is interesting about this crop is that oil was very important. And peanut oil from this peanut was shipped in vast quantities to France to be used as the basis for soaps. Anyone who has lathered up with a luxurious French soap is probably having some sort of relative of the Carolina African runner peanut lubricate them in the shower. But in our foodways, the peanut was particularly famous for a dish that was sold on every street corner in the big cities. Isabel? It's the groundnut cake. Here is an 1870s picture, a stereograph of one of the Charleston groundnut cake ladies. And on her tray, underneath her fly swatter, we see Bene twists, a coconut and molasses candy called monkey meat, and the famous groundnut cake, which installed itself in the love of every child in Charleston. And it existed all the way into World War I, when the fly ordinance, which was pushed by the US Sanitation Office in Washington, outlawed the sale of these things on the streets. And for the next 20 years after the World War I, there was just one lady who sold them in the theaters of Charleston. And then the Charleston Slave Museum also sold them. And then in the 1950s, they went extinct entirely. One of the things that we'd like to see is the revival of something like this wonderful candy, which once was the, if you wanted to think about signature foods of Charleston, nowadays we think of something like shrimp and grits, and people also talked about she crab soup. But this, in the 1800s, this was the signature. This is what people thought of as Charleston food.
All right, well, this has been incredible. And I think I want to provide a little bit of time so we can talk about some questions that people have. I want to start out with one. What were some of the more odd or like strange recipes that you found doing your research? Because I've looked at some things we have here at the Library Society, older books with recipes in them, and they're things like possum patties and like broiled squirrel and stuff like that. And I was wondering if y'all had anything that you found that really stood out to you, kind of like that.
Barbecue squirrel is a sort of a classic recipe, and possum with taters. That was classic dish, and indeed in the last part of the 19th century, that was an alternate to turkey during Thanksgiving. People had that. There are a couple of things that I think are really interesting. The most repulsive one I encountered was June bug soup.
Ooh.
Soup made out of June bugs, and I thought, I don't want to try that. But there were things that I had never tried that I wanted to try. And one was pickled ogeechee limes. And the ogeechee lime is the fruit of the tupelo tree, which we know more from Tupelo honey, which is made from the blossoms that produce those fruits. But there's a wonderful little manuscript recipe in this, I think it's the Stoney collection in the College of Charleston. No, it would be in the South Carolina Historical Society collection, for pickling ogeechee limes. And I have a letter to a honey producer in North Florida to send me ogeechee limes once I get back from California to South Carolina.
I love that. That's awesome. Another question we have was, have you found any growers of, and I might butcher this name, so forgive me, but choppy okra or choppy okra in the Hemingway, Johnsonville, Indianatown area? That's directly from the audience.
The choppy is a wonderful old okra that was collected in the Georgetown area originally. It dates from the 1850s, and it's a tall okra. There are people that are growing it. I think the folks at Carolina Heritage Farms that supply a lot of the restaurants in South Carolina grow it.
Okay. Another question was about the debate between the Georgia and South Carolina connection with peaches, because I know a lot of people associate Georgia as the peach state, but in actuality, South Carolina produces more. So, and I know y'all write about that in the book, I believe.
Yeah.
So if y'all want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think we're going to be getting prepared to continue that debate when people read this book, specifically those from Georgia, and even as a graduate student at the University of Mississippi, we read a book on peaches, and it dealt heavily with peaches coming from Georgia. And at one point, I wanted to tell my professor that he's got the wrong state. He needs to travel down to South Carolina, because here we grow more peaches, of course, than they do in Georgia. And same thing, I guess when you're talking about peanuts as well, right? People always associate peanuts with being from Virginia, but David so eloquently, pointed out that the African runner from this area is the king of peanuts. So I'm sure people are going to be asking those questions. Another thing that we did when we were kind of looking at what we wanted to write about, David posted on Facebook the list of the original list to get people to kind of chime in and say, hey, I think this is great. And we were getting a lot of questions about fried chicken. The one that was very fascinating to me was the question of how come we didn't talk about pimento cheese. So I'm sure people will be asking about that, but we know that pimento is more of a Georgia product as opposed to being in South Carolina. For me, one of the things that I thought was pretty interesting was, when we write about sweet tea or iced tea. When I first left the North and came South, the first place I went to work and live was in Atlanta. And that was my first introduction to sweet tea, specifically from someone being from the North. And I always thought that it was a Georgia thing. And then, of course, through research, we realized that no, sweet tea is definitely South Carolina.
Yeah, I personally love sweet tea, but a lot of people think it's way too much, but I like it. So another question we have was, could y'all kind of explain the difference between Benny seed and sesame seed, and if they're related in the same family, something like that?
Yeah. Benny seed is, well, let's begin with the other one. Modern sesame has around a 60% oil makeup to it. And when the seed is pressed, the Bene cake that's left over is too bitter to use for culinary purposes. It also has a seed pod, which is non-shattering. Bene is the landrace, the ancient form of sesame. It's about 45% oil. When you press the oil out of the cake is wonderfully nutty. It tastes sort of like tahini, which isn't too surprising, and was used as a culinary basis for stews. It was used as a roux. It was also fed to animals. The original forms of landrace African Bene were tan. Now, lots of you know that black seeded sesame exists. Another thing which is interesting is that Bene in its southern uses was never hulled. While modern sesame that's used in baking, the natural hull is milled off it to get at the undergrain.
You can see very noticeable, there's a very noticeable difference between the sesame and Bene, specifically, as Dave said, in color. If you put the two of them together, you'll see that the Bene seed is a little bit smaller, and of course, it's a lot darker than your regular sesame seed.
Okay, we should blow the cover off a dirty little secret here. Most of the Bene wafers that you buy from commercial sources are using modern sesame seed, not Bene.
Oh,
really?
Yeah.
We let the cat out the bag. Oh God.
Yeah, may I interject and ask a question about that? Because I'm deeply interested in Bene seeds, and I was wondering, is there a source for them? So when you go to the grocery store here, we often have to buy sesame seed instead of Bene. Where would one acquire Bene?
I get my Bene seeds from Anson Mills out of Columbia. They do have retail. You can go to the website and purchase a 1 pound bag of Bene seeds and have it sent directly to your home. They will also press the oil for you and send it to you as well, along with a lot of the other things that we mentioned, the Carolina Gold rice. They have Sea Island red peas. They have rice flour. They have a lot of different ancient grains that they, of course, are bringing back to life. But definitely Anson Mills for
Isabel?
For Bene, and also Bene seed oil.
Yeah. Just showing you some more things. I wanted to say a word about grits before we close up. In the 19th century, grits were particularly associated with Charleston. If you read the ads in Alexandria, Virginia, you'll see Charleston hominy grits. And it's the only grits that are shown. What is hominy? Hominy is the lye processed form of corn. If you do not lye process it, your body will not uptake niacin from it. And if you eat an exclusively corn-based diet, like some people in Appalachia did, you will develop a vitamin deficiency disease called pellagra. So the Native Americans, and this was in Central America, actually, that this was discovered, realized that by processing the corn in ash and water, you could disrupt the chemistry which prevented the niacin uptake in the body. And so no Native American group ever suffered from pellagra because of this process. And early, when Euro settlers came and adopted native corn ways, they lye processed their corn too. Now, in the end of the 19th century, people just started grinding dried down dent corns, and they called them grits, but they were not lye processed. They were not hominy grits. Hominy also exists in a whole corn form. It's called pasoli in the South, but it's called big hominy. in South Carolina.
Interesting.
Oh.
I've seen at the grocery store, I've seen like the whole hominy, I think in cans. In
Yes.
like the, but I've never tried it before. I'd be interested to see what it tastes like. But yeah, I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank y'all so much for being here with us, and everybody remember to go pre-order the book from Buxton. And
Yes,
Paula,
here it
do you
is.
have any?
I do.
Yeah.
I have, yes. Oh my goodness, you actually have an actual copy.
I have, David and I have an actual copy.
Oh, fantastic.
So
We are so excited for this book, and thank you for talking about hominy. I just have to put in a word for someone who was raised here in the Low Country. No one in my family would have ever called them grits. We called it hominy, and I don't know anything about the live processing versus another, but something has changed in the last 5 decades, and I myself am now even I am a little ashamed to say that I now call them grits, because otherwise you have to get into an entire conversation about what it means. But hominy, that's what we called hominy. That's what it was. Hominy for breakfast, hominy for lunch, hominy for dinner. That's what we ate, and it's really wonderful. And if you please order the book, give us a call and order it. We have signed book plates by both David and Kevin. This book is so extraordinary. I have my own list of questions that I'll have to wait and ask Kevin when he's here in person. Kevin will be here in the store on Buxton Books. We're on campus at the Charleston Library Society at 160 King Street, Sunday, October 17th at 1 p.m. He's promised to bring treats. I am going to make my grandmother's Benny seed cookies. They're not really wafers, but when I read Tony Tipton Martin's book and I made her recipe for Benny cookies, I tasted the batter and tears like streamed down my face. It would taste like it was my grandmother's cookie. And I told Tony that food has such powerful memories. It's such a powerful thing. So we will have cake, and we will have Benny seed cookies that make you cry, and we will have conversations. So come.
yes.
So,
we will have Duke's mayonnaise chocolate cake.
Yes.
Which is very interesting to me to have cake with mayonnaise, but it's delicious. And also I have some Benny seeds in the freezer. I will bring you some.
Oh,
One of the things that you can do with that Bene seed from Anson Mills is plant it, because it's viable, and you can have your own Bene plants. They're beautiful, have wonderful white flowers. They grow about 6 feet tall, and you can boil the small green pods before they harden, and they have that same quality as okra. They're a bit slippery.
Maybe we need to come back and have a whole interactive thing where we're planting and tasting. And David, I hope that you come back to this coast soon, and that you come to the Library Society, Charleston Library Society, and to Buxton Books. We can't wait to read this book. Thank you, Kevin and David, for sharing all.
Thank you both.
It's amazing.
Yeah, looking forward to being in the store. So everyone, come on out, get some cake, get a book, and some other things too.
Yes, that's right. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.